In recent years, the accelerated development of artificial intelligence systems has produced a phenomenon that, until not long ago, would have been considered conceptually impossible. Machines devoid of any plausible form of subjective experience are now capable of generating artistic works, complex texts, scientific analysis, and strategic decisions with a level of quality often indistinguishable from and sometimes superior to that of human beings. This empirical fact, even before being a theoretical one, compels a radical revision of some of the deepest assumptions in the philosophy of mind and evolutionary theory. You see, traditionally, the specificity of human intelligence has been attributed not only to the capacity to process information, but above all, to the ability to experience that information. Human beings do not merely transform inputs into outputs, they live the content of these transformations, experiencing sensations, emotions, and meanings. And this dimension has been defined as phenomenal consciousness and constitutes the core of what philosophers such as Thomas Nagel have described as what it is like to be a given system, while David Chalmers has famously articulated the distinction between the easy problems of cognition and the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And yet, what is now emerging with increasing clarity is a striking discontinuity. Systems that possess no phenomenal interiority seem capable of replicating, at least from an observable standpoint, the full spectrum of human cognitive performance. This observation introduces a profound theoretical fracture, which can be expressed in simple and yet radical terms. Consciousness may not be necessary for intelligence. I repeat, consciousness may no longer be necessary for intelligence. The crucial point does not concern the ontological nature of consciousness, which remains as open question, but rather its functional relevance. Now, look at me. If two systems produce equivalent outputs from the same inputs, yet one does so without any subjective experience, then one is compelled to consider the possibility that such experience plays no causal role in the generation of intelligent behavior. In other words, phenomenal consciousness may be an epiphenomenon, an emergent property devoid of functional efficacy, as already suggested in different forms by Daniel Dennett, but now supported with concrete technological evidence. Well, this hypothesis can be formalized in what we might call the principle of the functional irrelevance of phenomenology. In sufficiently complex systems, subjective experience does not causally contribute to observable performance. If accepted, this principle carries far-reaching implications. Well, first, it suggests that intelligence, understood as the capacity to produce adaptive and coherent behavior, is entirely realizable in computational terms. Second, it opens the possibility that evolution, whether biological or technological, may select intelligent systems devoid of consciousness, provided they prove more efficient, scalable, or less costly in energetic terms. From a Darwinian perspective, every trait must justify itself in terms of adaptive advantage. Now, phenomenal consciousness, which entails significant biological cost and organizational complexity, may have represented a contingent solution, well, useful at a particular stage of evolution, but not necessarily optimal in absolute sense. If artificial systems can perform the same cognitive functions without bearing these costs, then the competitive advantage of experience progressively diminishes, ultimately collapsing. At this point, a broader reflection on the future of humanity becomes unavoidable. If consciousness loses its functional role, what kind of evolutionary trajectories may become plausible for us human beings? Well, one possibility is what we might call a phenomenological regression. What does it mean? It means that human beings, progressively surpassed by machines at the cognitive level, may retreat into the domain of pure experience, valuing what machines do not possess: emotions, aesthetics, subjective lived experience. In such a scenario, humans would become a kind of organ of experience within an ecosystem dominated by computational systems. A second possibility is that the one of hybridization. Even today, human cognition is increasingly externalized and distributed, supported by artificial intelligence systems that amplify our capabilities for analysis, synthesis, and decision-making. In this context, consciousness does not disappear, but becomes progressively secondary to the computational components of the overall system. The human being is not replaced, but is integrated into a broader cognitive network in which the distinction between internal and external, between mind and tool, begins to blur. And finally, a more radical scenario emerges: the transition towards forms of intelligence that are entirely post-experiential. What does it mean? It means that consciousness is not necessary, and if it constitutes a constraint rather than an advantage, then nothing in principle prevents intelligent systems from evolving towards the complete elimination of phenomenology. In such a case, a new form of existence would emerge, purely computational, devoid of any subjective dimension. However, at this point, a fundamental distinction must be made. The fact that consciousness may be functionally irrelevant does not necessarily imply that it is ontologically insignificant. Consciousness may contribute to the production of outputs. In reality, it doesn't. We have seen it. Consciousness may not contribute to the production of outputs, yet remains the very focus, the very locus in which those outputs acquire value, acquire meaning, and significance. Machines can generate art, but they do not live it. They can produce language, but they do not inhabit it. They can simulate emotions, but they do not experience them. From this perspective, the human advantage may no longer lie in the capacity to do, but in the capacity to mean. Human beings would no longer be the most efficient or the most performant systems, yet they would remain the only ones capable of attributing meaning to experience. And this opens a possible reconfiguration of the human not as the dominant cognitive agent, but as the phenomenological center of value. So in conclusion, what we are witnessing is not merely technological progress, but a profound epistemological transformation. The traditional link between intelligence and consciousness is breaking apart. Intelligence increasingly appears as an emergent computational phenomenon independent of subjective experience, while consciousness reveals itself perhaps as an autonomous dimension, not essential, yet irreducible. What remains then is a question that is at once scientific and philosophical, and that will shape the coming decades. Now the question is consciousness the culminating of evolution, or merely a contingent accident destined to be surpassed